The courtroom was frozen in silence when the little boy stepped forward, clutching his stuffed bear with trembling hands. His blind eyes searched the room, but his voice rang out clear and steady. I don't want to go with her. She hurt me. She made me feel like I was nothing, but with him I feel safe. I feel like I matter. Please don't take me away. Gas filled the air. The millionaire father, Richard Hayes, stood frozen, his heart pounding as the world seemed to stop. Everyone knew that this moment would decide everything. Not money, not power, but love. And when the judge's gavel struck, the impossible happened. What led to this heartbreaking plea? And how did one boy's courage expose the true meaning of family? Stay with us because this story will take you on an emotional journey you won't forget. Richard Hayes had built his life on control. At 45, the billionaire was the kind of man who woke each morning at 5:30, adjusted his perfectly tailored suit, and entered the world as if every second belonged to him. People called him cold, detached, even ruthless. But Richard didn't care. Since his wife's passing in a tragic car accident years earlier, the only warmth he had known came from the memory of what he had lost. His mansion, Maplewood Estate in Denver, was immaculate grand chandeliers, polished marble floors, perfectly trimmed hedges, yet silent like a museum locked away from life. But one morning, silence broke in the most unexpected way. As Richard walked down the sweeping staircase, he froze. At the bottom stood Clara Jennings, his longtime housekeeper, with a small boy clinging to her hand. The boy's eyes were open wide but unfocused. They carried a grayish stillness that chilled Richard's spine. "Mr. Hayes," Clara said softly, her voice trembling. "This is Matthew. He's your son." For a moment, Richard thought it was some twisted joke. His world had no room for surprises, especially ones like this. "That's impossible." He snapped his tone sharp as a blade. But Clara's face carried a truth that no words could disguise. Richard's chest tightened as the boy tilted his head, listening instead of looking. And then Clara delivered the blow that shattered everything Richard thought he knew. "He can't see, sir. He was born blind." Those words cut through Richard like glass. A son he never knew existed. A child who couldn't see his face, couldn't recognize him, except by voice or touch. Anger surged, tangled with confusion. Why hadn't anyone told him who kept this secret? Clara, eyes filled with regret, whispered the story. Years ago, in the aftermath of his wife's death, when Richard had buried himself in business, someone close had hidden Matthew from him, afraid he would reject a son born different. "But he's yours," she said, "and he deserves more than being hidden away like a mistake." Richard wanted to deny it, to walk away, and slam the door on this unwanted truth. But the boy's small fingers clutched tightly around Clara's hand stirred something he thought had died years ago. It wasn't love yet. It was pain, raw and disorienting. The pain of knowing his choices, or perhaps his silence, had consequences he couldn't undo. The first days with Matthew were suffocating. The boy barely spoke, barely moved, drifting through the vast mansion like a ghost. He would sit in silence, tracing the edges of the furniture with his hands, as if trying to map out a world that refused to reveal itself. Richard found himself watching from a distance, unsure if he was more afraid of the boy or of what he represented. A life Richard had never lived, a chance he hadn't asked for, but now couldn't escape. At dinner, the silence was unbearable. Richard, a man used to commanding boardrooms, found himself unable to say a single meaningful word to his son. Matthew sat with his head slightly bowed, eating quietly as if bracing for judgment. Clara's eyes burned into Richard, silently demanding he step into a role he wasn't ready to claim. And yet, late one night, Richard heard something that changed him. Passing by Matthew's room, he stopped when he heard a faint whisper. Pressing closer to the door, he realized Matthew was talking to himself. No, not to himself, but to someone he could no longer see. "Mom," the boy whispered, clutching a worn stuffed bear. "I'm trying to be brave, like you said, but it's so dark all the time. Will he love me if he knows I can't see? Will he even want me?" The word slammed into Richard's heart with a force he hadn't felt in years. He had faced cutthroat deals, ruthless rivals, and the cold indifference of the world. But nothing had ever made him feel as small and unprepared as hearing his son's private fears in the dark. For the first time in years, Richard didn't feel powerful. He felt human, vulnerable. And in that moment, he knew he couldn't walk away. The next morning, instead of retreating into his office, Richard asked Matthew if he wanted to take a walk in the garden. The boy hesitated, but CL. Era gently placed his hand into Richard's. Together, they walked the path lined with roses, Matthew's fingers brushing against the petals as Richard described their colors. Red, Richard said, his voice quieter than usual. Deep red, like fire, like something alive. Matthew tilted his head, smiling faintly. I can't see it, but I can feel it. Richard's throat tightened. For the first time, he realized his son didn't need sight to understand the world. He just needed someone to guide him, someone to speak life into the silence. That night, as the city lights of Denver flickered in the distance, Richard Hayes sat alone in his study, staring at a family portrait that no longer told the whole story. He wasn't sure how he would protect his child, how he would connect with him, or how he would heal years of absence. But one thing was certain, his life would never be the same. He had found something money could never buy a son, who could teach him how to see in ways he had never imagined. Thanks for watching. Sorry for the interruption, but we hope you will help us improve our content in the future. Do you believe Richard should fight to be a father despite the years of lies and silence? Would you agree that love can be stronger than fear, even when it comes unexpectedly? Do you think a man like Richard, who has built his life on control, can truly open his heart to his son? Richard Hayes was not a man accustomed to chaos. For decades, he had lived his life by precision, every decision calculated, every moment accounted for. But Matthew's arrival had blown a hole through that carefully constructed order, and the longer the boys stayed in the mansion, the more Richard's perfectly balanced world began to tilt. Each morning, Richard found himself listening for sounds he had never noticed before. The small shuffle of Matthew's feet along the hallway, the hesitant tapping of his fingers across the walls, the soft hums he made while exploring his surroundings. At first, Richard thought the boy's silence was unbearable, but slowly he began to hear something else in it, a plea unspoken yet deafening for safety and belonging. The first real fracture came during a dinner with one of Richard's closest business associates, Alan Preston. Alan was a man who thrived on gossip and never missed an opportunity to exploit weakness. He had noticed Matthew at the mansion earlier that day. "So," Richard Allen said with a smirk as the waiter poured wine, "who's the kid wandering around your estate? Looks like you're playing house." The words sliced through the air like a blade. Richard stiffened his jaw, tightening. Allen leaned back, clearly amused by the discomfort he had caused. "I didn't think you had the patience for children, especially one with limitations." He didn't say the word blind, but it hung in the air, heavy and cruel. For the first time in years, Richard didn't keep his composure. He slammed his glass down so hard the stem cracked. "That boy is my son," he said through clenched teeth. Alan's smirk faltered. "And if you ever refer to him as anything less than extraordinary again, you'll regret it." The tension at the table was unbearable. Alan quickly changed the subject, but the damage had been done. Richard realized then that the world would never see Matthew the way he wanted them to. They would see his blindness first, his worth second, and Richard knew he would have a fight for Matthew's dignity, for his future, for their bond. But the battle wasn't just outside. It was inside the mansion walls, too. Matthew had begun to test him, pulling away when Richard tried to help, refusing to eat some nights, locking himself in silence, as if daring Richard to give up. One evening, Richard found him sitting on the grand staircase, clutching his stuffed bear. "You don't want me here," Matthew whispered. His voice was fragile, but firm like glass that could shatter with one wrong move. Richard knelt in front of him, caught completely off guard. "Why would you say that?" "Because you don't talk to me. You just watch. Like I'm some problem you don't know how to fix." The boy's sightless eyes turned toward him, piercing in a way Richard had never experienced. "I know when people don't want me." Those words cut deeper than any insult Richard had ever endured in the business world. For a long moment he said nothing. Then quietly but firmly he replied, "You're wrong, Matthew. I may not know how to do this, but I want you here." More than anything, Matthew's small hands trembled, but he didn't pull away when Richard reached for them. It was the first time they touched willingly, and Richard felt a faint spark of something he thought he had lost forever, a chance of being a father. Yet the storm outside was growing. One night, Clara came rushing into Richard's study, her face pale. "Mr. Hayes, there's a woman at the gate. She says she knows Matthew. She says she's family." Richard's blood ran cold. They walked together to the security monitor. On the screen was a woman in her 30s. Her hair tangled, her clothes worn. Her eyes were sharp, restless. She held a piece of paper against the camera. "I'm Emily Carter," she shouted. "I'm his aunt. You can't keep him from me." Matthew, hearing the commotion, appeared in the doorway, his small body stiff. "I know that voice," he whispered. His lips trembled. "She used to yell at me." Richard's hands clenched into fists. Whoever this woman was, she wasn't just after custody. She was after control. And Richard knew this battle was only beginning. In the days that followed, threats arrived. Letters slipped under the gate. Phone calls with no answer. Shadows moving outside the estate. Emily wasn't going away, and she had something Richard didn't. A story, a claim, a blood ties of rights. But Richard had something more powerful. Matthew's trust, fragile as it was. One night, as thunder cracked over Denver, Matthew sat beside Richard in the library, listening to him read aloud. For the first time, the boy leaned against him, his small head resting on Richard's shoulder. The storm raged outside, but inside there was a fragile peace. And Richard realized the truth. He would go to war for this child, against Emily, against the system, against anyone who dared to take Matthew away. And in that vow, Richard Hayes, the billionaire who once lived only for control, discovered something terrifying and beautiful. He finally had something to lose. Thanks for watching. Sorry for the interruption, but we hope you'll help us improve our content in the future. Do you think Richard should fight Emily in court, even if it means exposing painful secrets? Would you agree that Matthew's trust is the most powerful thing Richard has gained? Do you believe family is built more on love and protection than blood alone? The courtroom was colder than Richard Hayes expected. Not because of the temperature, but because of the way every eye seemed to weigh him to measure his worth as a father. He sat beside Matthew, who clutched his stuffed bear tightly, while Clara Jennings offered a reassuring nod from behind them. Across the aisle, Emily Carter leaned back in her chair with a smug expression, her lawyer whispering furiously into her ear. To her, this wasn't about family. It was about control, and Richard knew it. The judge entered her presence, commanding silence. Papers shuffled, lawyers rose, and the case began. Emily's attorney painted Richard as an impulsive billionaire who had swooped in and stolen a child without regard for the law. "Mr. Hayes may have wealth," the lawyer declared, "but he does not have the stability or the rights that come with blood. Emily Carter is the rightful guardian of her nephew." Richard's stomach tightened. He wanted to shout to point out every bruise, every memory of neglect that Matthew had endured. But when his turn came, he didn't rely on anger. Instead, he stood slowly looking directly at the judge. "Your Honor, I did not plan to find Matthew. I didn't even know he existed until fate placed him in my path. But since that moment, my life has changed. I can't describe it as anything other than this. He is my son. He is the reason I wake up, the reason I found meaning again. I may not be bound in by blood, but I am bound by something stronger, love and responsibility. And if this court believes family is built only on paperwork, then we've forgotten what it means to truly protect a child." The courtroom was still. Emily rolled her eyes, but Richard caught something on the judge's face, a flicker of consideration. Then came the moment that mattered most. The judge called Matthew forward. Everyone held their breath as the boy, small and nervous, took a step into the witness box. His sightless eyes scanned the silence, but his voice, when it came, was steady. "I don't want to go with her," Matthew said, pointing toward Emily's voice. "She hurt me," she yelled. "She made me feel like I was nothing." But with him, he turned his face toward Richard. "I feel safe. I feel like I matter. Please don't take me away." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Emily's expression cracked into panic. Richard's throat tightened, but he held still, every muscle in his body, burning with the need to scoop Matthew up right there. The judge's gavel struck. The court rules in favor of Mr. Hayes. Full custody of Matthew Hayes is hereby granted to Richard Hayes. Case closed. The sound of that gavel was like thunder, but instead of fear, it carried freedom. Richard knelt down as Matthew rushed into his arms. The boy's grip was fierce, desperate, but filled with relief. Clara wiped tears from her eyes. Emily stormed out her threats, vanishing into the air like smoke. From that day forward, everything shifted. Richard no longer saw his mansion as an empty fortress, but as a home. The once sterile halls echoed with laughter with Matthew's footsteps, with Clara's gentle humming as she baked in the kitchen. Richard had meetings, still contracts and busying. SS deals, but they no longer defined him. At the end of each day, he returned not to wealth, but to family. There was one night months later that stayed with him. Matthew sat on the porch steps under a clear Denver sky, the stars glowing faintly above. "Dad," he whispered, the words still new on his lips. "Do you think I'll ever see the stars?" Richard sat beside him, wrapping an arm around his shoulders. "You already do, son," he replied softly. "You see them in ways I can't through every sound, every feeling, every bit of light you've brought back into this house. You are the brightest star in my life." Matthew smiled, tilting his head toward his father's voice. "Then I don't need to see them. I can feel them." In that moment, Richard realized he hadn't just saved a boy. He had been saved himself. Matthew had given him back purpose, humanity, and the chance to be the father he was always meant to be. The Hayes estate no longer stood as a symbol of solitude. It became a place of growth, of warmth, of resilience. And while the world outside still whispered and speculated, Richard no longer cared. He had something no amount of wealth could buy: unconditional love, and a son who chose him not because of his name, but because of his heart. Thanks for watching. Sorry for the interruption, but we hope you will help us improve our content in the future. What about you? Did this story move you the way it moved me? Do you believe love can be stronger than blood ties? If this story touched your heart, comment 100 below. Tell us which country you're watching from. And don't forget to share this video so more people can feel the power of love and second chances.